on the multitude of threats facing the planet. As UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said last year, the Doomsday Clock is a global alarm clock. Have leaders acted with urgency? The Bulletin has been watching. Hello, I'm Rachel Bronson, President and CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Today I'm joined by members of the Bulletin Science and Security Board, those who help set the Doomsday Clock. Our goal is to provide some insight into why we have set the clock at 90 seconds to midnight. And if you'd like to know more, we've released a statement today that goes into greater depth and can be found at our website at thebulletin.org. After our brief discussion, we'll be turning to renowned science educator Bill Nye and UChicago professor Daniel Holtz, the chair of the Bulletin Science and Security Board. But before we do that, I'm joined today by Asha George, Executive Director of the Bipartisan Commission on Biodefense, Princeton Professor Alex Glaser, and Stanford Senior Researcher Herb Lin. Joining us from India is Professor Ambush Sagar, who helps lead the Indian Institute for Technology in Delhi. So let's dive in. Alex, there are two key messages in our statement. And they are, one, that 90 seconds to midnight is profoundly unstable and must not engender complacency. And two, the advancement of technology is quickening and outpacing our ability to govern them. But let's pull back the curtain for our audience today and talk through why we've set it. So Alex, can you summarize the highlights, or I guess the lowlights, of the current nuclear landscape?
Thank you, Rachel. When we set the clock last year, there were major concerns that nuclear weapons could be used in Ukraine. And today's clock setting was still overshadowed by the war in Ukraine, but also the war in Gaza, which has caused enormous human suffering and could lead to a broader conflict in the region involving several nuclear weapon states and regional powers. So it's really against this backdrop that we're facing a crisis in nuclear arms control, and I could go into great detail, but let me highlight perhaps just two aspects. First is that traditional nuclear arms control really has come to an end for now. Russia withdrew its ratification from the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which the United States, of course, never ratified to begin with. But perhaps more importantly, that's the second point. Many weapon states are currently pursuing extensive modernization and expansion programs that will really, for the first time since the end of the Cold War, and essentially providing the last until 2100. China is increasing its nuclear arsenal, now standing at 500 nuclear weapons. And for the first time, at least in my adult life, there's now talk in Washington that the US nuclear arsenal will have to increase also in order to match the arsenals of Russia and China combined. So in many ways, we're setting ourselves up for a three-way arms race, which is unprecedented and quite concerning. So the picture is quite bleak on the nuclear side this year.
Yeah, there's a lot that we'll come back to. Ambush, I'd like to go to you now. Maybe you can set the scene for us on climate, which has had a tough year as well.
Sure, happy to do so. On climate, the story has really been a mixed story. There's been a fair amount of bad news for sure, but there's also some good news. I think, as already mentioned, 2023 was the hottest year on record, and a range of extreme events across the world made more likely by climate change. Global greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise. Global and North Atlantic sea surface temperatures broke records. Antarctic ice was at lowest levels, and I could go on, but I think one gets the picture. I do want to note that not everyone is obviously affected equally by this, and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit later. Also, unfortunately, the policies and pledges in place to address climate change do not allow us, at least as of now, to meet the Paris Climate Agreement goals. Having said that, there is some good news. We are moving in the right direction, even if not as fast as one would like. Renewables are dominating new energy deployment. Last year, there was $1.7 trillion invested in clean energy. Um, uh, at the climate COP in Dubai a few months ago, 2 months ago, 120 countries representing a significant fraction of the world's GDP will peak by 2030. So on balance, as I said earlier, we're moving in the right direction, but not as fast or as deeply as one would like.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Herb, this past year, artificial intelligence was really kind of on the table in new disruptive technologies. We spent some time really talking through it in our deliberations. Do you want to kind of set the landscape for how we should be thinking about new disruptive technologies, maybe with a frame around AI?
Sure. We debated whether AI was going to be an existential threat to humanity. It turns out there is debate about that, large amount of debate in the community, even among experts. Regardless of whether you believe that it is or is not going to be an existential threat, it's clear that it's a disruptive technology, and it's going to, it has disrupted many segments of society already. AI has lots of potential for magnifying corruption in the information environment and making the disinformation problem worse. And that's really bad because the threat multiplier effect means that we're not going to be able to solve other hard problems like nuclear war and climate change. And so that's really tough. That makes solving those problems much harder. And we talked about the question about AI and is it going to pose an existential threat. I have to note that any physical threat to existence from AI has to come because somebody chose. Yes, that's an existential threat, but that's a nuclear threat. That's not an AI threat.
Mm-hmm. And Asha, I wanted you to follow her because I know we talk in the biosecurity, even biosafety, but the biosecurity space, there's a lot of thinking about its connection with AI in addition.
Popped up, but it didn't. We've had a pretty long tail on this one, and we've seen it improve and improve and improve, which it's supposed to do. It's AI, it's supposed to. But last year we heard more discussion about AI and its application in terms of genetic engineering, but also in terms of developing biological weapons, posing questions that would allow a person without a whole lot of technical expertise to obtain biological agents, put together a biological weapon, and so forth. And there are also the applications to facilities. As Herb said, you can hook GPT up to something and make those two systems work together. Now suddenly you can access a facility or figure out how a facility works too, and that has pretty big implications for laboratory biosafety and biosecurity.
So one of the things at the Bulletin that we spend a lot of time thinking about is not only the advancement of the technology, but how it's governed, right? Mm-hmm. That technologies have huge potentials, but also huge risk. And if we can manage those risks, we can benefit from its potentials. There's actually been some pretty interesting governance efforts. Herb, I'm going to come back to you, particularly that's worth noting. Again, probably not fast enough, but in the AI.
I recognize some need to govern AI in some sense, in the broad sense of the term, and this, of course, that's what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. that some nations, many nations, do recognize that need. But there's also the other side of that is that all of these nations hope that AI is going to give them military and strategic and economic advantages over their rivals, and so any agreement to among nations to curtail or govern or restrict the application of AI in any way is going to
kind of attention to it, but not nearly fast enough.
Not nearly fast enough, but also there is this tension between advancement and using this tool to help with the safety and help with with the research efforts that have to go on, and maybe get ahead of some of these things. There's that on the one side, and then on the other side, there's all this horrible, terrible stuff. So governance can't just handle the one negative piece. It has to take into account the other side. And there's this whole thing about economic and other competitiveness with the world's bioeconomy right now. You cannot just up and tell a country or countries, hey, you can't use this. They have to think about the economic implications for themselves. To say that we're going to cut off a tool like this entirely isn't realistic, and so it poses another challenge to governance. How do you govern when you have a situation like this?
Ambush, I'm going to pull you in here because I think in terms of governance, you were mentioning COP and the instruments we have around climate, but also I know this point on who it affects and how is something you think about quite often on the equity side of it. So I wonder if this might be a good point for you to jump in.
Sure. The climate problem is an interesting one because it really is a global problem. It affects everyone, and everyone actually has some effect on climate change through their emissions. So it's one of these issues that really does require global governance, and also efforts to try to move the needle forward jointly. Green technologies that actually, in a sense, is at odds with cooperation in some way. So we have this tension there, and then of course, because the magnitude and the nature of the climate threat varies drastically across countries. It depends on local manifestations of climate change. It depends on local social and economic circumstances and capacity. And therefore, we have this situation where different countries are experiencing the problems differently, and different countries have different kinds of capabilities to engage with the problem. And this is playing out in this global arena where we have to work together, but there are also these different national interests. So it is a challenge, but we are moving forward, again, slowly and not as quickly as we would like, but still moving forward.
Yeah, I think there's some real similarities when we think of how everybody's affected different. It certainly comes up in the biospace. But Alex, when it comes to global governance, in your opening remarks, it's kind of a despairing time in kind of the nuclear conversations. What are you seeing on the global governance landscape? Because it is so extraordinarily important that we do have some engagement between the nuclear powers in particular.
Well, I would remind us that the 2010s were actually the first decade since the end of World War II that hasn't seen a new nuclear weapons state. Today, and a lot of credit goes to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the nuclear taboo that has evolved with it. But the treaty, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, is in a crisis, in a deep crisis. We haven't seen a lot of progress with regard to nuclear disarmament, and we mentioned already efforts to re-modernize and expand arsenals. So the one highlight that I would mention here is really the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, which outright bans the possession and the use of nuclear weapons. It actually even bans. But speaking only for myself here, in my view, the treaty does offer a new perspective on important nuclear issues for many countries and their citizens. And I think, looking forward, it may not be likely, but I think it's still quite possible that the treaty will gain new momentum in the next couple of years, especially perhaps in Europe, when the war in Ukraine has been resolved and a sustainable peace agreement has been found, and the countries reevaluate their positions and policies toward nuclear weapons, perhaps especially in Europe.
So a question at the bulletin we always get is, well, what can individuals do? What can people do? How to get engaged? And it's very difficult because these are huge global issues. And just a couple years ago when we had Hank Green on, he said, no one individual can solve all these problems, but we can't solve any of them without individuals. So maybe very quickly in our last few minutes before we move over to Daniel Holtz and Bill Nye, Alex, I'm going to come to you. Why don't you start us on, is the TPNW a place that people can get engaged, or is there other ways that people can try to keep pressure on their leaders to create a safer future for us?
Well, you mentioned the TPNW. Let me just perhaps, if I had one point, I would say 2024 is an election year in many countries around the planet. Voting matters, and elections raise the issue of the immense power vested in U.S. presidents who have the sole authority to order the use of these weapons, and they can do so within minutes. This has always been, in our view, a very dangerous arrangement. And now I firmly believe that the risks of part of the conversations that we're going to have around the U.S. elections, later this year.
And then Herb, thank you, Alex. Herb, to you, with so much of this in the private sector, presumably on a lot of this tech, there's other avenues for individuals to help make a difference?
Well, I think that the fact that the private sector holds so much influence and power over the deployment of these technologies, AI, for example, space technologies, for example, they have a huge amount of influence. And I think that the first thing people ought to do is to understand that these private sector actors don't necessarily act in the national or international interest. They act to serve their own goals, the goals of profit, the goals of their CEO or what have you. And I would urge people to think about how one can govern private sector actors, especially in democracies, which is not an easy task.
Asha, I think that you struggle with that as well, or think about that, but what about in the biospace in terms of if individuals are watching, how can they pay attention to this, how can they get engaged?
Well, look, I think everybody, individuals all the way up to the highest levels of government and our international organizations, I think we need to pay much more attention to what's going on with bio. We should not, any of us, be in some country and has made it to our borders. We all know that disease doesn't know any borders anyway. We can maintain some awareness, we can maintain some preparedness, we can do some things about our own health, we can care about what's going on in other countries. But I also think we should be maintaining some awareness of what's going on with weapons threats, what's going on with the laboratory down the street. These are all things that we can know about, and we can be speaking to our elected and other appointed officials. And Alex talked about the presidency, and individual votes do count for who gets into Congress. We should be paying attention to what their platforms are and what their approach is. I think we've gone way too long sort of ignoring bio and putting it off to the side under nuclear, under climate change, under other disruptive technologies. We can do this. We're educated people all throughout the world. Let's pay attention.
Ambush, I'm going to give you the last word before we move on, but why don't you talk a bit about how individuals can engage on climate? There seems to be a little bit more space maybe there, and especially sitting in India, what are you seeing?
Yeah, well, I think on the climate area, I think my views will very much echo what's already been said, right? That individuals certainly can play a very important role. The climate area is interesting. Some of the earlier questions or issues in the climate area were around whether climate change was indeed happening and whether human activity was responsible for it. That was an issue that was settled in the scientific domain. And in many cases, in the social and political domains, although as we know, not fully. There still is efforts to, and actually concerted efforts to have disinformation around climate change to even question issues that have been settled scientifically. So I think that's the first area where individuals can play a role, is to make sure that there is increasing societal consensus around the science of climate change. Governments, because the nature of the problem is such that governments really have to lead from the front. And I think we also need to make sure that there's equal attention being paid in political and policy circles around adaptation, which is making sure that the people who are getting affected most by climate change are basically we're able to manage and reduce the impacts of climate change on those people. Secondly, I think the point I want to make is that while it's true that this is, as I mentioned earlier, it's a global problem and everybody's should be engaged in the problem, it's not a problem that has been caused by everybody equally. Countries and people who are richer have contributed more to the emissions historically, and therefore, because this is a problem of accumulated greenhouse gases, it's a cumulative responsibility. But also, and perhaps more importantly, not everybody has equal capacity and resources to engage with the problem. So while it is truly a problem where everybody has to engage, individuals and countries, we also have to understand that the leadership for engaging with the problem cannot be equal. Those with the greatest privilege, the greatest resources, the greatest financial and technical resources really have to take the lead in that. And I think individuals across the world have to make sure that their political leaders really understand this reality, and therefore push for climate action, but push it in a way that's fair and equitable and just.
Over to my colleague Daniel Holtz and Bill Nye. Before I do, though, I really want to thank our members of our Science and Security Board today, Ambush Sagar in India, Alex Glasser from Princeton, Asha George here in the U.S., in Washington, D.C., where we're seated right now, Herb Lynn from Stanford. Thank you so much. And Daniel, over to you right now. Okay, so apparently we're going to hold until we get to Daniel and Bill. So while we do that, why don't we turn back here? And I think that if we don't fix that shortly, we're going to say goodbye to our audience. So thank you for that. But let's see if we can get it fixed beforehand. Alex, I think I'm going to come back to you one more time. I know we went pretty quickly through some of the changing nuclear realities. And I just want to give you a little bit more time to maybe talk through a little bit on the landscape. We've been hearing about North Korea and things that are happening there. We still continue to watch developments in Iran. Is there anything that maybe we can add in? And then if we're not able to fix the technical difficulties, I think then we'll probably close out with that.
Well, you're right. A lot of the attention currently, and rightfully so, is on the war in Ukraine and in Gaza, as I mentioned, but these other crises have not gone away, that in a normal year we would be talking about at one of these events. North Korea is essentially proceeding with its nuclear program. The Bulletin just ran an article earlier this week, including by Sikh hacker, arguing that North Korea might actually be preparing for war, which is something that no one really talks about very much. So that is still very much in many ways. The JCPOA, of course, the agreement that where Iran at some point may be involved. So these are crises that are looming, and that we haven't talked about very much, but it doesn't mean that they don't exist, not at all.
Right, and just because it's a natural segue, Asha, you've been watching these wars and crises, and it gives you a lot of concern in your colleagues about how to think about different biological crises. I know you've thought and talked about that. Could you just share that a bit?
Well, I think there are two things. One is many of the same comments that Alex just made could be made about the biological side. The State Department talks about two countries, Russia and North Korea, having active offensive biological weapons programs. It talks about China and Iran also engaging in some activities that could or may not be biological weapons oriented. And we have to assume that there aren't just four countries that are looking at this. So we have that. We have this specter of the use of biological weapons on battlefields in crises. But then you also have the other side of it, where war and public health are inextricably linked. So if you have wars and countries in crisis, their health goes down, the public health goes down, they become more vulnerable, and then we have more diseases, circulate. We'll talk about, has talked about the impact of climate change on disease is particularly worrisome. I mean, yes, it's all global, but in arenas where there's already war going on and crises already going on, it's just a huge complicating factor. Melting of the Arctic and some of the encroachment that we're talking about that contributes to climate change also contributes to diseases coming to the fore that we haven't seen in many, many years. I mean, centuries, and I would imagine in some cases. But it's a new day, and there are new weapons. I think the greatest difficulty, though, is going to be, at least with a nuclear weapon, you can see it. Same thing with chemical. With biological, I don't know that it's going to be quite that obvious. Nobody should be, from a military standpoint, coming forward with a biological weapon that just destroys everybody all at once. You'd actually want to do something lower level. So there's a question. And our ability to attribute things, as we've seen with other diseases, is not great, not here in the United States or throughout the world. That's my perspective, our perspective on biological weapons, and it's something we have to continue to track as we go forward from here.
And just because you mentioned attribution, Herb, I know you're one of the loudest voices in our room as we're talking through this about mis and disinformation and our ability, as attribution and some of these issues become so much more important, the inability to know where to turn, who to look for authoritative information. That's something you've been thinking a lot about, and what that actually means for our ability to solve problems. You want to talk a little bit about in the kind of advancement of those technologies?
Well, so artificial intelligence gives you, for example, the idea that you can create deep fakes of images and videos and audio and even text that sounds authentic but isn't. And these polarize opinion further and so on. Today it is possible to, first of all, there are no technological solutions to that. For every deep fake that comes along, yes, you could probably develop a way of, especially with audio and video, you could probably develop a way of detecting that it was fake, but a technological way, but there'll be this interval where you won't have coming from. You have to care whether or not this is really true. And by doing some research and so on, you can find out whether it's checking other sources and so on. But of course, the problem with that is that you have to check sources that you might not otherwise trust. You might have to check, a mainstream media source for that rather than some fringe source. So you have to want to do that, and that's really the biggest problem. So if people want to be able to defend themselves against this stuff, first they have to care. If you want to do it, then there are many ways of helping yourself out. But the first, most important thing is that you have to care.
Well, on that, we're going to take a short break, and we'll be back momentarily with Daniel Holtz and Bill Nye. Thank you to our guests today, and hold on shortly, and we'll be back to you in a moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, and I'm delighted to be joined by science educator Bill Nye to discuss actions we can take to turn back the hands of the Doomsday Clock. So, Bill, you've pointed out that many apocalypse films start with characters ignoring the warnings of scientists.
Yes, yes.
And we've just heard scientists and experts raising alarm bells. So my question to you is real life following the plot of a disaster movie?
I guess so. Yeah, I remember very well Colossus, the Forbin Project. This is an older reference from the disco era. But the premise was that the Soviet computers, the computer that controlled Soviet weapons, if the two computers could agree on not blowing stuff up full time. But when you write a computer program in the good old days, by that I mean 3 years ago.
You travel the world giving talks and speaking with people. What is your sense of the level of awareness and kind of engagement with climate change? Is the tide finally turning?
Well, the tide is turning-ish. Everybody, don't take my word for it. a few years ago, the mainstream media, as it's referred to, New York Times, Washington Post, Baltimore Sun, whatever it might be, would have an article about climate change once a month or something. Now there's an article almost every day with a reference to climate change. Even in the Wall Street Journal, which is sort of two newspapers in one, the regular reporting has climate change every day, and the editorial page doesn't. And everybody running for president on the other side, on the conservative side right now, none of them are willing to mention climate change. And the one guy who did has dropped, they've all dropped out. So that's bad for the future. And people say to me, Bill, Nye, science guy, what can I do about climate change? Vote. Vote. It all adds up. Vote. We can do this, people. We can do this.
And this is my next question. 2024, as what's been mentioned, is this unusual election year. Billions of people around the world voting. So how much does our future depend on the outcomes of these votes?
Well, it's the most important thing in the world. Is that a big deal? So I thought you were being... I'm of a certain age. I used to say that the election of 2000 was the most important election of our lifetime, because no matter what else happened, if Al Gore, and people love to hate Al Gore, knock yourselves out, but if he had become president, we would have done something about climate change. But as it was, we didn't do anything about it. In fact, things just got worse and worse. Snowball, pun intended, effect, got doubled down on drill, baby, drill and all that. But with that, fine, knock yourselves out. But the world's climate is changing because of human activity, and the U.S. has to lead. Now look, I'm from the United States. American English is my first language. Okay, I got all that. My perspective is skewed or influenced or whatever. But the United States is the world's most influential culture. No matter what else you say about it, it is the world leader in culture. And so we want to export our values as well as whatever else we might sell. And along that line, we want to be the world leaders in renewable energy and fairness. What everybody's running around nowadays, all bent out of shape about diversity, equity, inclusion issues. That's all about being fair. We want it to be fair, inclusive, and we want to change the world. Back to you, Daniel.
And all of this impacts all of us, including those of us in the U.S., so we need to be engaged. And so kind of along those lines, we've heard, about all these threats to civilization, nuclear and bio, climate change.
The biological threat is the real deal, man.
Yeah, pandemics. I mean, there are lots of things to worry about. So my question is, how do we raise the alarm? How do we convey this kind of sense of urgency without making people despondent? And,
Or it's all so bad, there's nothing we can do, and so on.
Yeah.
You got either team thinks they're going to lose. Like, that's not how this works, man. By the time you get to the world, vote. And just please take the environment into account. The environment includes climate change, human-induced, all this carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, biological threats, and this accidental incorporation of all these crazy weapons, which just happened with people disagreeing for a few decades.
Yeah, so vote, talk to your friends, talk to your family.
The other thing we could do, Daniel, he started it, don't come running to me. The other thing we could do about climate change and biological threats and so on is talk about it. If we were talking about it the way we talk about all these other important issues, crime, football games, we would be doing something about it. And so when I look at the atomic scientist clock, that is a conversation piece, literally, right? This thing, this minute hand is set up to get people talking about these big issues.
Right. Yeah.
So thank you.
And the idea, 90 seconds to midnight, the idea is it's a conversation starter. Like, this is meant to prod people to
So it used to
wrestle
be
with
10 minutes or something, right? With 17
yeah,
minutes.
17 minutes at the end of the Cold War.
the end of the Cold War. The Cold War is still going on.
Yeah,
Everybody, okay, you hate me, you hate people of my background and ancestry, I got all that, you hate progressive. But the thing in Ukraine is just the extended dance mix of World War II. I mean, it's still going on.
Yeah,
It's not something you can fool with, people.
Now with nuclear weapons.
Yes, now with nuclear weapons.
And you know, not only Russia, but China, we're headed into a three-way arms race. It's really...
It's a solvable
it's frightening.
problem. Nobody wants to shoot.
Speaking of stopping, that's probably a good place to end. I want to thank science educator Bill Nye. To learn more about the Doomsday Clock and why it's at 90 seconds to midnight, and to follow these important issues all year long, please check out our website, thebulletin.org. Thank you for joining us. We are adjourned.
Tonight, with the polls opening just hours from now, New Hampshire's Republican primary is down to a two-person race. The major shakeup, former President Donald Trump and Nikki Haley facing off one-on-one after Ron DeSantis abruptly dropped out and endorsed Mr. Trump. Haley trailing by double digits, fighting for her political life. Can she pull off an upset? Our team in